So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jonathan Crane. I'm a professor of Jewish thought and bioethics at Emory's Center for Ethics, and it's a privilege to moderate this panel on social, medical, and spiritual perspectives on flourishing. So, perhaps um, the the side of this conversation that resists the mathematization of these concepts. And I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them in order and all at once here so that they can just flow directly to the between the speakers. Our first panelist is Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is Rector and Distinguished Service Professor of Philosophy at American Jewish University, where he is now teaching his third generation of rabbinical students. He has written 15 books on Jewish thought, law, and ethics, and edited or co-edited 14 more. His most recent book is Ethics at the Center, Jewish Theory and Practice for Living a Moral Life. And more importantly, he's married to Marlon, and they have 4 children and 8 grandchildren who contribute mightily to their thriving. So he is flourishing down in Los Angeles. On the other coast is Alan Astrow, who is chief of hematology and medical oncology at New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, where his clinical practice focuses on breast medical oncology. He is also professor of clinical medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine. His primary area of research interest has been doctor-patient communication and the ethical and spiritual dimensions of oncology practice. His most recent essay, Thinking About Hope in the Care of Cancer Patients, was published in a 2025 issue of the Hastings Center Report. He is co-principal investigator of a $4 million study funded by the National Institutes of Health, investigating the role of chaplains in outpatient care of patients with advanced cancer. And our final speaker this afternoon is Shira Weiss, teaches Jewish thought at Yeshiva University's Bernard Revel Graduate School, and is assistant director of Yeshiva University's Sachs Herenstein Center for Values and Leadership. She holds a PhD in Jewish philosophy and has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment of Humanities, the Templeton Foundation, Ben-Gurion, and Oxford Universities. She's the author of Joseph Albo on Free Choice, Ethical Ambiguity in the Hebrew Bible, and co-author of The Protests of Job, an Interfaith Dialogue, as well as articles in academic journals and anthologies. This is going to be a fantastic organization, and I would like to invite Elliot to go ahead and give us his preliminary thoughts on where Judaism and flourishing intersect.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Jonathan, and so good to see you, even though we're across the country. I still can't really, I'm 82 years old. It's still amazing to me that we can all see each other on this kind of a mechanism. I thought I would respond to the question about how Judaism interacts with flourishing by referring to several different stories. The first is I've been on the Beit Din, on the rabbinic court, for at least 100 people converting to Judaism. And there are 3 things. Everybody's different, and truthfully, only about 20% are converting because they want to marry a Jew, and that's okay as long as they're in love with Judaism as well as a Jew. The other 80% are converting simply because they have fallen in love with Judaism. And the three responses I get all the time as to why do you want to become Jewish are the following. Number 1, I can ask any question. So the understanding of Judaism as being intellectually vibrant and open. Number 2, a very strong sense of family and community is what they sense in Judaism, which I'm sure they come from families and communities before they decided to become Jewish, but they sense in Judaism this very strong sense of connectedness. And along with that is, I'd like to mention just a little poem I saw in my dentist office one time. I sought my God I could not see. I sought myself eluded me. I sought my brother and I found all 3. Right? A very strong sense of how community leads, along the lines that we were just talking about this morning and last night as well, right? A very strong sense of how a sense of community and connection can lead to a sense of identity and a sense of connection to God as well. And the third thing that they almost all mention is a sense of the importance of what we do in this life. Now, I mean, I was going to talk about what Judaism says about afterlife, and we had some of that discussion last night. But certainly converts to Judaism that at least I've encountered. One of the reasons that attracts them to Judaism is the sense of the fact that we have to fix this world, tikkun olam, gemilut chasadim, those kinds of things, and the fact that we not only have that duty, but we have that ability, and that therefore we, along the lines of free will, that we not only have the free will to be able to decide to do those kinds of things to fix the world, but we also have the ability and therefore the responsibility to do that. I do a lot of interfaith work, and one of the things I often say to non-Jewish audiences and to Jewish audiences is that Judaism spells responsibility with a capital R. And that very much comes in this kind of this worldly orientation. That doesn't mean that we don't have that the Jewish tradition doesn't have assertions about life after death, but the focus of what's on the radar screen of the vast majority of Jews is this life, and then maybe some things about life after that, in the far corners of the radar screen. Second thing that I wanted to mention to you was that in the 1970s, I was during the summer, I was the conservative rabbi that Shlomo Bardin, alav shalom, the director of the Brandeis Bardin Institute, would bring up to that facility. The BCIers, the Brandeis campaign, these were college and graduate students who would spend either July or August at the camp. And every morning there would be a scholar in residence for about 2 hours, and then in the afternoon they had an hour of mandatory Israeli dancing and an hour of mandatory Israeli singing. And then he would have a scholar for the month, but he would have an Orthodox rabbi come up for a day, a conservative rabbi, a Reconstructionist, and a Reform rabbi. So I was the conservative rabbi during many of those sessions. And in the afternoon, they would do their thing, and in the evening, they would have a discussion session with whoever the scholar was or whoever the visitor was. So I talked to Shlomo Bardin. He had a doctorate in education from Teachers College, and I asked him, remember, this is the early 1970s, a lot of anti-Vietnam stuff and so on. These were the same people that were taking over administrative offices in colleges and universities, and they did an hour of Israeli dancing and an hour of Israeli singing without objecting. So I said to him, why do you require that? And he said, because Judaism is caught, not taught. In other words, it's caught emotionally rather than caught intellectually. I frankly think that Judaism is both caught and taught. But I think one of the things that Judaism contributes to flourishing is the wonderful music, the culture that we have in music and dance and literature and all of that. And I think that that's part of what Judaism contributes to our flourishing. Third thing, I was and again back in the 1970s, a friend of mine, Perry London, also alav shalom, unfortunately, was a professor of psychology at USC, at University of Southern California. And one morning at 6 a.m., we started bike riding, and Perry said to me, Elliot, how do you get meaning out of life? And I said, good morning, Perry. I was barely awake. And so then I thought for a little while, and I said, well, one way we get meaning out of life is that we have particular goals and we act toward those goals. And I remembered a friend of mine who, starting in 7th grade, knew he wanted to be a dentist. So when we both took biology in 10th grade, he got an A and I got an A, but it meant much more to him than it did to me, because for me, it was just the next thing you took if you were on the academic track, whereas for him, this was his first introduction to what he would ultimately do. So you gain meaning in life by working toward goals. And then Perry said to me, I'm quoting him now, your Bubby and mine didn't talk about long-term goals, but they knew that Shacharit was Shacharit, Mincha was Mincha, Ma'ariv was Ma'ariv, and that there was the Chol and the Shabbat, and that there was the round of the seasons and the round of the life cycle. And it's the marking events like that created meaning in life. And what occurred to me was that this was the exact opposite of Sartre's book, No Exit, where he portrays life as just being one moment after another with no distinctions among them. and that what Judaism was doing, among other things, was making the morning of every day different from the afternoon and different from the evening, the weekday different from Shabbat, and the various seasons of the year and the various seasons of the life cycle different by marking them. And that was one of the ways in which Judaism contributed to flourishing, to human meaning and flourishing. And the last thing I wanted to mention was one verse that we say 3 times a day in traditional liturgy. It's Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha. Happy are those who live in your house, God. Right? So part of what Judaism does, I think, that helps the human flourishing is that it gets us out of ourselves. It gets out of ourselves communally, the family and community things I was talking about a moment ago, but it gets us out of ourselves also in terms of what philosophers call our egocentric predicament. In other words, the fact that we have no way of getting out of ourselves except if we earnestly try to do that. And one of the things, all of the blessings of God, I mean, does God need your blessings? Probably not, right? But you need to bless God because you need to get out of yourself and think about the fact that you are not the be-all and end-all of the world, that you are part of a community, you are part of an environment, you are part of a transcendent element in human experience. And that one of the things that Judaism does to enable us to flourish is to get us to recognize that and therefore lead to gratitude. In the book this last book, Ethics at the Center, one of the things I say at the very beginning is that although Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel thought that awe and wonder were the central religious feelings of Judaism, I think there's a lot of awe and wonder in Judaism. I'm grateful for that. But I think, frankly, gratitude is the central Jewish religious feeling. And so we say, Modeh ani lefanecha. We're supposed to say that, and I thank you, God, at the moment you get up in the morning. We say, Modim anachnu lach as part of the Amidah 3 times a day. So, I mean, I frankly think that this transcendent element of human experience that the Jewish tradition tries to call our attention to which our tradition tries to call attention, my mother was an English teacher, sorry, is a vital piece of what Judaism contributes to our flourishing. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Elliot. That was wonderful to hear those anecdotes to illustrate your points. And so now, Alan, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, thanks very much. And thank you, Hava. It's been such a pleasure participating in this conference and talking about flourishing, particularly when, as we all know, there are so many troubling developments in our country and in the world. And it has been a pleasure to reflect on what we might mean by flourishing. So what might we mean by flourishing when we think about the role of medicine in the modern world? And is there any particular Jewish perspective beyond the secular that might deepen our understanding? That's the question I want to try to address. If flourishing relates to overall well-being, scientific medicine, one of the great triumphs of modern life, would seem to serve that end, contributing to a lengthened lifespan and reduced suffering from disease. But is this kind of understanding, an understanding that seemingly predisposes our ability to master the universe, enough? That's my question. Most of us are likely familiar with the enormous contributions Jews have made to health and medicine. We heard yesterday, 25% of all Nobel Prize winners in medicine have been Jewish. In pre-World War II, Germany, Austria, and Eastern Europe, almost 50% of the physicians were Jewish. I'll just mention a few prominent Jewish physicians who have transformed healthcare. Paul Ehrlich, Selman Waxman, Rosalind Franklin, the DNA Code. Rosalind Yallow from the Bronx, Hunter College, class of 1941. Kept a kosher home, by the way. Alfred Sabin, Jonas Salk, Drew Weissman, who is responsible for the mRNA vaccines, and Alfred Bourla, the chairman of CEO of Pfizer that produced the first COVID vaccine. Bernard Kouchner, French Jew, who co-founded Doctors Without Borders, which is currently banned from Gaza for unclear reasons. And in nursing, Lillian Wald. Perhaps this has something to do with our religious and cultural heritage, the high intrinsic value that we accord to each individual life, to the role of the concept of pekuach nefesh, which means the obligation to save a life, And perhaps it relates to having other career opportunities foreclosed to us because of anti-Semitism. For the purposes of this conference, a question we might raise is, given the enormous advances in medical science over the past 100+ years, why the widespread dissatisfaction with medicine? Why are so many people, as Professor Keyes suggested yesterday, languishing? The deaths from despair, the substance abuse that has led to the deaths of so many people in the prime of their lives. Despite the many scientific marvels to which Jews have contributed greatly, why is the average American lifespan flat at around 79? With health such a widely agreed upon good, why the frequently raised concerns that our system of healthcare is on the verge of collapse? And why, as Berkeley political scientist, the late Aaron Waldowski put it nearly 50 years ago now, why are we continually, quote, doing better and feeling worse? And finally, since this is the Judaism Science and Medicine group, might the Jewish religion be of any value in putting us on the right path? In the words of the old standard song, written by the son of a cantor and his atheist Jewish lyricist colleague, when all the clouds darken up the skyways, perhaps there's a rainbow highway to be found, leading right from our window pane. I'm going to suggest here that the problem is overreach. This was nicely illustrated yesterday through a reference to the WHO definition of health as not merely absence of illness, but much more broadly as, quote, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. While social and economic conditions are certainly crucial to health, the continuing tendency to medicalize issues that demand a political response led, in the case of mental health, at least yesterday, to the suggestion that the entire U.S. population needs to be monitored for the absence of good mental health. Is this realistic? And let's take cancer treatment, my field. In 2003, then director of the National Cancer Institute, Dr. Andrew von Eschenbach, declared a goal to, quote, eliminate suffering and death from cancer by 2015. Well, we're 2026 now. One can endorse the goal and yet still question the excessive optimism, the overblown and unattainable ambition. This is not to deny the many miraculous new life-saving anti-cancer drugs that have developed during my 40-year career as a medical oncologist. The difficulty here is that unrealistic optimism from the medical establishment can be transmitted to patients and leave them feeling bereft and unsupported in the face of undesired outcomes. Let me show you just a few slides if I can. This is the trends in cancer death rates, 1975, 2022. All right, down a little bit. Here's incidence. Up. Here is, you hear the trends. Okay, lung is down in men. Colon rectum is down. Everything else is pretty much flat. Here, women. Okay, lung is down. Breast is down some. Everything else is pretty flat. So, okay. So I think that's just the data. Okay. You may feel that being overly negative, but it's just the data. Cancer death rates have gone down some, but there's still a lot of death from cancer, okay? And so roughly 15 years ago, I helped conduct a study of patient expectations in early phase clinical trials that showed, unsurprisingly, that most cancer patients hoped for therapeutic advance. They thought the drugs were going to get rid of the cancer. And we all wish that human suffering will be ameliorated through advances in medical science. Let me just tell you right now, I just finished a course of radiation therapy for prostate cancer. I certainly hope this treatment was successful. I certainly hope so. But what happens when the treatments do not work, when our target is out of reach? This is a critical question for physicians and nurses who may be present with patients at moments of profound existential challenge. Good doctors need to stick by their patients, regardless of whether the treatments we give them are successful or not. This was why I reacted fairly negatively to the focus yesterday by Dr. Eisen on success. I'm in favor of success, but I don't think we should be worshiping success. As a doctor, you got to stick by all your patients, not just your successful ones. And you don't think that doctors tend to shy away from patients who don't respond well to the treatments? Well, I'm telling you, they do. It takes a certain amount of spiritual discipline to remember that the patient you don't want to see is the patient you have to see, period. Okay, both anecdotal reports and scientific data suggest that when it comes to supporting patients' hopes, physicians often fall short. We do a bad job of this. At the scientific symposium, The Art of Science of Hope, in June 2024, at the annual ASCO meeting, researcher Mary Boulanger, she's from the Dana-Farber, she reported that patients with lung cancer and melanoma who had high hopes in anticipation of receiving one of the new immunotherapy drugs were shocked and devastated when their cancers did not respond. So again, I'm just reporting the facts here. Sometimes these treatments work, but sometimes they don't. And you can say it's just being a downer, but I've been a doctor for a long time, and you really have to stick with all your patients. That's what you have to do. That's part of the job. And you want to make sure you don't make them feel bad because their treatments didn't work. Okay, let me illustrate the problem by relating two case histories of patients I'm currently seeing. Here's one of my patients. She's 67. I first met her when she was 40 years old. That's 27 years ago. Okay, and she was diagnosed then with a large aggressive breast cancer with 7 positive axillary nodes. Okay, what that means is you are at extraordinarily high risk for recurrence and death from this cancer. And she was HER2 protein positive. That means it was the most aggressive of all the cancers. It's like a death sentence, okay? But just around that time, a miraculous new drug was discovered, a drug called Herceptin. Some of you may have heard of this drug. And this was not the discovery of a Jewish doctor. It was the discovery of Dennis Slayman from UCLA. Dr. Dorff, maybe you're in Los Angeles, maybe you know Dr. Slayman, a remarkable doctor. He's the son of Syrian immigrants he's from West Virginia. His father was a coal miner. It's what's so great about America, not just for Jews, but for all of us, okay? All of us. And he pressed on, even no one believed him. And he's responsible for this drug, Herceptin. And let me just show you, again, I want to go back to share the data, what this drug, Herceptin, does. Can I find this? Yeah, let's go back to this. So the drug was just, it's 1999, the drug just had come out. It was only approved for cancer that had spread, and hers was a regional cancer that didn't have distant spread. So it took a lot of doing on my part to get the drug for her. I knew it was going to work. I knew it, okay? If she doesn't get the drug, she's down here, okay? And she's with 7 positive nodes, I'm telling you, she's down here. She's dead. She got the drug. She's up here. And 27 years later, she's alive. I'm seeing her. I see her once a year now. Now, is she flourishing? I don't know. She's alive. She happened to be alive. And that's it. I'm glad she's alive. I like seeing her. You know, it's like anyone else. She's trying to get through. She's a painter. Okay. Now, but here's another case. So that's a good story. Trying for modern medicine. And it's part of this story. But here's another one. Patient 66. 6 years ago, she's treated by another oncologist. She had a really bad, big breast cancer. It also involved her axillary nodes. But, it was a triple negative cancer. These don't respond too well. She had surgery, chemo, radiation. Unfortunately, cancer came back recently. Went to her lungs. It's recurrent in her breast. It's bad. And she came to see me, and so I gave her one chemo regimen, and it didn't work. And so I'm giving her another one now. A new drug, sacituzumab govitecan, Trodelvy, plus pembrolizumab, okay? And she got one cycle with this, and it's responding. It's responding, getting a little smaller. But the insurance company is now denying it. Why? It's $40,000 a treatment, minimum. That's just the cost of the hospital. Insurance companies probably getting billed $50,000. That's for one treatment. So you just think about it. It's like $500,000 for a 6-month course. You can understand why the insurance companies are reluctant to approve it, but they're going to lose. They're going to lose because it's an effective treatment. I've got the data. And I work with just an extraordinary nurse practitioner. I think she's watching this now. And she won't take no for an answer. The drug companies have no chance against her. And we're going to get this drug for her. Okay. But right now, She is quite distraught, this patient. She's crying on the phone. I'm not making this up because we've had to delay her treatment. And that is what is going on. This is the reality of cancer medicine now. And the truth is, this treatment is very, very unlikely to cure this patient. If things go well, we'll extend her life a little bit. So might the Jewish tradition be helpful in addressing the complex issues that clinical staff and patients experience in confronting the medical and human dimensions to a cancer diagnosis? That's my question. Is the Jewish tradition any help? Well, yesterday we learned from Professor Eisen that the secret to Jewish success in the modern world includes a number of dimensions, among them, though, this worldly focus on education and achievement, and the high value according to individual autonomy. Okay, so it's about taking on the world, getting things done, and being autonomous, right? And I'd like to suggest that these are good, absolutely good. But in facing a cancer diagnosis, sorry, not good enough, just not good enough. Certainly, the role for autonomous choice-making is crucial to the provision of ethical medical care. And arrogant paternalism by medical practitioners prior to the advent of the patient's rights movement in the 60s, a movement in which Jewish Americans played a central role, did enormous harm, that arrogant paternalism. But sickness, as we all know, we've all been sick. When you're sick, it's a reminder that you're not so autonomous. You need other people. It's a reminder of how needy we are, how dependent we are when we're really sick. Isn't that the truth of things? And how frail we are. We're not in command all the time. I just saw a patient this morning, just a couple of hours ago. I'm sitting in my office. I got office hours today. When I finish here, I'll be seeing patients again. He says to me, "Doctor, am I going to live?" That's what he said. These are the kind of questions people ask you. As A.J. Heschel noted in an address to the American Medical Association in 1964, he talked to a bunch of doctors. He gave them a pretty stern tongue lashing. And he said, we all hope for cure, but the calling and conduct of the doctor, and I add here the nurse, is care for others. Care for others. We want cure, but care. Doctors and nurses need to show care for others. So is there a religious outlook within Judaism that might promote care for others? That's my question. Here, I'm going to return to Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And Professor Weiss, he was at Yeshiva University, wasn't he?
Yep.
Okay. So he wrote a book called The Lonely Man of Faith. And he established this well-known typology. Where everyone noticed when you read the book of Genesis, there seem to be two creation stories. And there's Adam the first and Adam the second. And Adam the first is the commanding Adam. God gives him the right to name all the animals and to subdue the earth. And as Soloveitchik comments, it's about man and his role of a creator, creative activity. And he says, only the man, this is what Soloveitchik says, only a man who builds hospitals, discovers therapeutic techniques, and saves lives is blessed with dignity. That's Genesis 1, Adam the first. His mastery has made it possible for him to act in accordance with his responsibility. Well, that was Professor Eisen yesterday. His whole book is about mastery. Okay? Well, Professor Eisen, I've got an assignment for you. Instead of talking about the Jews who succeeded, how about your second volume about the Jews who failed, the Jewish nudniks? How about a book about Epstein and Madoff and Weinstein? We got plenty of those too. Let's face reality. Sorry, guys. It's a more complicated world than just success and mastery. And Soloveitchik saw it. That's what he said. Because Adam II, according to Soloveitchik, and Professor Weiss, you'd know more about this than I would, he said, when Adam II, that's the Adam who messes everything up, right? He eats the apple even though he's told not to, and then he blames his wife. He's the typical guy, right? And then his kids get into a fight, and Cain kills Abel. And then we end up with a flood and all kinds of the Tower of Babel. Everything starts going wrong with Genesis 2. So we're no longer the mastery we're no longer in charge here. And Soloveitchik says what Genesis 2 is about, he's called cathartic redemptiveness. So let me put that into English. He says dignity is discovered at the summit of success. Success, that's Professor Einstein's book. Redemption is the depth of crisis and failure. That's part of Judaism too. It's not all success. Our God acknowledges both. And then so Soloveitchik in another book called On Repentance, really interesting. He quoted from the Talmud, where penitents stand, a penitent is someone who's really contrite, who admits his or her mistake. The full-fledged righteous do not. So from Soloveitchik's point of view there is that if you've done bad, if you're a sinner and you're truly contrite, God prefers you to the one who's fully righteous. He prefers the people, the men and women who have sinned and failed and then try to make up for it than the success stories. Then of course, then you got Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to those of a broken heart and saves those of a contrite spirit. That's our religion. And I want to say here that point of view is equally crucial. And that's what Soloveitchik would say. We all want to pay attention to the success stories. We worship the wealthy, right? The young, wealthy, attractive. But Soloveitchik says, no. Our religion is about both. The Jewish religion is about redemption. God having the power to save us even in the face of failure. So yesterday I commented facetiously, I have to admit, that my academic colleagues would be best off throwing away their philosophy books and reading the book of Exodus. I have to admit, that was a little much. So I'll apologize for that statement. And for the record here, I am signed up for a course through Yale Alumni College on Plato and Aristotle. Okay, and my bedtime reading now is a book on the American pragmatists. So I think philosophy is great. Okay, I believe in philosophy, but I do believe that religious understandings have the potential for a more profound understanding of the nature of reality and of what constitutes a good and meaningful life than what we learn from the Holy Secular. I think you get more from religion. It's not that philosophy isn't valuable. If you get a perspective beyond the secular from religion, and the Jewish religion in particular. Just think for a moment here of Lincoln's second inaugural address, right? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray. That address is suffused by Lincoln's intuitive understanding of the biblical outlook and biblical cadences, because he grew up reading the Bible. That's how he grew up. And he was not a pious guy at all, Lincoln, by the way. And at a conference on flourishing, I have to conclude. Again, I hope it's not too much of a downer, but that's what I have to do. I have to conclude on a note of sadness, that so many of us, especially the most highly educated among us, and Jews in particular, have lost that sense of easy familiarity with our core biblical heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for those deep thoughts on medicine and Judaism and flourishing. And now Shira.
Thank you. And thank you, Chava, for inviting me, and Lisa for the logistics. I want to touch upon two ideas. One that Alan just concluded with, the biblical values, and what Elliot had mentioned earlier in terms of gratitude. I'd like to begin by asking, is flourishing the goal of a Jewish life? And Rabbi Jonathan Sacks distinguishes the Jewish conception of happiness from that of Aristotle, and he further differentiates happiness from joy. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that there's only one good that we seek as an end in and of itself, and for no other reason, namely eudaimonia, his term for happiness. However, as a student of philosophy, Rabbi Sacks questioned, does Aristotle's view of happiness as activity of the soul in accordance with virtue align with Judaism's values? Or does Judaism have a different understanding of happiness, namely to live in accord with the world and will of God, which is how the Bible construes moral life? In his essays on ethics, Rabbi Sacks writes, happiness, said Aristotle, is the ultimate good at which all humans aim. But in Judaism, it's not necessarily so. In his essay, Happiness, a Jewish Perspective, Rabbi Sachs writes more decisively that happiness is not central to the Judaic value system. It's not the telos of human activity. Judaism is the pursuit of holiness, not the pursuit of happiness. Happiness may be the result, but it's not the aim. However, the Bible doesn't discount the value of happiness altogether. In fact, the first word in Psalms, as Elliot mentioned before, is ashrei, the Hebrew word for happiness. And the book of Psalms begins by describing the happy life. It reads, "Happy is the man who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat where scoffers sit. But his desire is in the Torah of the Lord. On his Torah he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by streams of water, bearing its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in all that he does, he prospers." Rabbi Sachs concludes that Jews can flourish if and only if they live a life of Torah, in which he writes, "Ashrei is a state of one who has lived in accordance with the will of God, a person who is good and does good, who honors God and his or her fellow creatures, who has been blessed in life, and who, living among the righteous, is held in high regard. This is the happiness of this is the happiness of balance and virtue, of justice and compassion, of living well and faring well." So how Aristotle defines eudaimonia, living well and faring well, Rabbi Sachs argues for Jews is defined through observance of Torah. Now, Rabbi Sachs distinguishes between the values of ashrei and simcha. Ashrei, or happiness, he argues, is not the central value of Judaism, because the life of the Jew should not be governed by the pursuit of happiness, as Aristotle advocated, but rather the pursuit of joy. Unlike ashrei, which is self-centered and predicated on the individual as individual, simcha is collective. It only exists a virtue of being shared. It's a form of social happiness. It's relational and rooted in memory and history, and it's the way a culture is geared to sense of gratitude. Whereas the Aristotelian vision is individual, cerebral, and contemplative, the Judaic vision is communal, relational, affective, and action-oriented. Simcha, or joy, is a social emotion we feel when we merge with others. It's the redemption of solitude. Now, Rabbi Sachs cites a few biblical examples. A newly married man does not serve in the army for a year so that he can stay at home, as it says in Deuteronomy 24:5, and bring joy to the wife he married. Moses says in Deuteronomy 12:7, "You shall bring all your offerings to the central sanctuary so that there, in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your family shall eat and rejoice in all you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you." The festivals, as described in Deuteronomy, are days of joy, precisely because they are occasions of collective celebration. As Deuteronomy 16:11 specifies, "You, your sons and daughters, your servants, the Levites in your town, the strangers, the fatherless, the widows living among you, shall rejoice together." Simcha is shared joy. Now, paradoxically, the biblical book most focused on joy is precisely the one often thought of as the unhappiest of all, and that's Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes. Kohelet is notoriously the man who had everything, yet describes it all as hevel, a word that's translated in many different ways as meaningless or pointless, futile, empty, or as the King James Bible translates it, as vanity. Yet after each of his meditations on the pointlessness of life, Kohelet ends with an exhortation to joy. Kohelet 3:12 is one of these examples, and it reads, "I know that there's nothing better for people than to rejoice and do good while they live." Rabbi Sachs teaches that Kohelet finds meaning in life, not in happiness, but in joy, because joy lives not in thoughts of tomorrow, but in the grateful acceptance and celebration of today. We're living in God's land, enjoying his blessings, eating the produce of his earth, living the life he renews in us each day, and even though we don't know what tomorrow may bring, even though it was never the safe or easy option to be a Jew, when we focus on the moment, allowing ourselves to give thanks, when we do things for their own sake and not for other reward, when we let go of our separateness, then there is joy. Rabbi Sachs writes how Jews have known suffering, isolation, hardship, and rejection, yet they never lacked the religious courage to rejoice. A people that can know insecurity and still feel joy, Rabbi Sachs writes, is one that can never be defeated, for its spirit can never be broken nor its hope destroyed. As individuals, we may aspire to the goodness that leads to happiness, but as part of a moral and spiritual community, even in hard times, we find ourselves uplifted by joy. Celebrating together binds us as a people. That and the gratitude and humility that come from standing before God and realizing our achievements are not self-made, but rather blessings of God. The pursuit of happiness can lead to self-regard and indifference to the suffering of others. But joy connects us to others and to God. Joy is the ability to celebrate life, recognizing that whatever tomorrow may bring, we're here today in God's universe. However, I don't think that the joy Rabbi Sachs describes requires throwing caution to the wind or calls for the abandonment of fear, especially during life's trials, whether external fear of enemies or internal fear of humbly standing before God. Rather, fear and joy can and should coexist. 15th century Spanish Jewish philosopher Joseph Albo argues in his Sefer HaIkarim, the Book of Principles, that in contrast to Aristotle's eudaimonia, but similar to Rabbi Sachs, submission to Torah leads to human flourishing and joy. Albo writes, belief in God and in his Torah brings man to ha'atzlacha hanitzachit, eternal success, and causes his soul to cleave to the spiritual substance. He explains what belief and observance of God's Torah entail, and introduces in this context the seemingly opposing values of fear and joy. Albo identifies the essence of the performance of a commandment is fear of God. He also affirms that divine service must be inspired with joy if it's to be complete, but acknowledges the difficulty of reconciling fear with joy. As the virtue of the soul and the intellect increase, one comes to a greater appreciation of the sublimity and exalted character of God, standing in awe of him and fearing the transgression of his commandments. Albo writes, when one finds in himself this degree of fear, he should rejoice in this fear, for it shows health of soul and perfection of intellect. He explains that not fearing that which should be feared reflects a defect. For instance, if one is not afraid to put his hand into the fire, it demonstrates either an aberration of mind or insensibility of the hand. Accordingly, Albo innovatively interprets David's words, serve the Lord with gladness, as referring not to a light and frivolous fulfillment of commandments, but rather an observance inspired with fear. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling, as it says in Psalms. He explains how the soul considers the sublimity of God in contrast to one's personal lowliness, and thus one simultaneously rejoices as one fears and trembles, apprehending that God is deserving of fear, an indication of intellectual perfection and health. Albo affirms, quote, this joy therefore makes the service perfect and complete. Albo reconciles this fear and joy by conceiving of the trembling one experiences when inspired with fear of God as the toil which one exerts in pursuit of a valuable goal. Despite the arduous effort, one rejoices when reflecting upon the purpose of the fear, namely, submission to God and his service. As an illustration, Albo references Abraham following his trial in the binding of Isaac. God proclaims right after the trial in Genesis 22:14, when Abraham was ready and willing to slaughter his son, God says through the angel, now I know that you're a God-fearing man, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Albo comments, then when Abraham withstood his test joyfully and with good humor, the Bible called him friend. All this shows, Albo writes, that the cheerful endurance of toil and trouble in the service of God gives perfection to the servants and the fear of God. As Rabbi Sachs affirmed, Judaism is the pursuit of holiness, not the pursuit of happiness. Joy can be the byproduct or the result. In biblical, medieval, and contemporary times, even in challenging circumstances, we find ourselves uplifted by joy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shira, for those deep reflections on Jonathan Sachs and Albo. And so now it's an opportunity for us to have a meaningful conversation over the next 30 to 45 minutes or so. And I'll take moderator's prerogative to ask a preliminary question, which perhaps threads across all of these presenters. They each raised this concept of gratitude, of acknowledging that what we've got right now is bounty, even if this bounty is imperfect. And this notion of acknowledging what our bounty is, even if it might not necessarily be 360 degrees perfect, it's still good enough. And I want to lift up this notion of enoughness and wonder whether you can offer some reflections on how does Judaism encourage us to acknowledge that enough is a concept, enough is an experience, and enough is something for us to embrace with contentedness, and not to always be in comparison to other people or even to ourselves when we were perhaps younger, healthier, smarter, wealthier, whatever it might be. But to just embrace this notion of enoughness, and whether that might be a way to constitute this elusive thing we call flourishing.
Well, Shira mentioned Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, so let me talk a little bit about him. He is, he's seen as being, when I first read Kohelet, I thought, the reason why we read him on, sorry, on the Shabbat of Sukkot is because the rainy season is about to come, and it's a dreary time, and it's a dreary book, right? But then I had Robert Gordis for Kohelet, and he pointed out that actually that's not what Kohelet says. Kohelet says that, yes, our lives is, we don't have any permanent and everlasting control over life, either in our own lives or thereafter. But contrary to the Stoics, let's say, who have the same idea, you can't really change life permanently. So they would say, detach yourself from life. And contrary to the Buddhist, they would say, life itself is a sham. So try to divorce yourself from life altogether. That's not what Kohelet says. Kohelet says, I'm quoting him in chapter 9, go and eat your bread in gladness and drink your wine in joy, for your action was long ago approved by God. Let your clothes always be freshly washed and your head never lack ointment. He's talking to men. Enjoy happiness with a woman you love all the fleeting days of life that have been granted to you under the sun, all your fleeting days. For that alone is what you can get out of life and out of the means you acquire under the sun. Whatever is in your power to do, do with all your might. He wants us to live with gusto. To live. He doesn't want you to sort of lay back and say, well, nothing's worthwhile because nothing's going to last. Live your life with gusto. Do whatever you can. Whatever is in your power to do, do with all your might. For there is no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom in Sheol, in the grave, where you are going. So his reaction to the impermanence of life is very much enough, right? It's basically get out of life whatever joy you can, whatever meaning you can, do whatever you can to make life better, right? And enjoy life in the meantime, right? Now, that's the wisdom tradition, right? And you get very much like that in the book of Proverbs as well, right? But then you get the aspirational parts of our tradition. Kedoshim tiyu ki ani Adonai Elohechem kadosh. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The sort of the header statement in Leviticus 19, and then you get a whole set of descriptions of what it means to be holy. Meaning holy does not mean being ascetic. Actually, I had a very good friend growing up who was also a very devout Catholic, and he talked a lot about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So when I think of holy, the first thing I think of is ghosts. And that's one of the reasons English is a Christian language. It was created by Christians. Don't be surprised. And the vast majority of people who speak it as their native language are Christian. So don't be surprised if a lot of Christian words have a lot of English words have a lot of Christian connotations. Holy in the Catholic world, the holy people are the priests and the nuns, right, who are ascetic. The holy people in our tradition are not that at all. Right? And what does holiness consist of? Leviticus 19, respecting your parents and observing Shabbat, taking care of the poor, having honest weights and measures, don't bear a grudge and don't be vengeance, but rather rebuke your friend when you need and love your fellow as yourself. Right? All of that is what it means to be holy. So it's a very again, responsibility with a capital R. It's a very live your life with gusto, do what you can to help your fellow human beings, worship God because God is the ultimate model of who we're supposed to be. Although there are stories in the tradition that where God is not such a great person, a great model for us. I'll leave that to the side. And by the way, even in terms of Jewish law, right? I mean, the rabbis already understand Jewish law as something that has to be evolving. So there, I think they themselves count 36 different offenses in the Torah that lead to the death penalty. And by the time you get to the rabbis, this is the Mishnah in Makot, chapter 1, right? Where the Mishnah says a court that decrees a capital offense once in 7 years is a bloody court. The others say once in 70 years. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon say that if they were in the court, there would never be a capital conviction. Now that's really changing the Torah, right? And so and these are the rabbis. This is long before modern times. So following the Torah has to be with judgment, and not everything that we inherited are things that we want or should continue with in terms of being faithful Jews to our tradition, because our tradition changed things over time as conditions changed and as our moral sensitivities changed. Certainly, for example, the role of women in our time is very different in Jewish law, and I'm in the conservative movement, and we do it, and even in parts of Orthodoxy these days, has changed radically from what it was in the past. More recently, gays and lesbians, and even in terms of things that our tradition, we still have it. Honor your father and mother. What did that mean in the Jewish tradition? It meant that you took care of your elderly parents yourself. But now nobody's home during the day, and we don't live in extended families. We live in nuclear families. So how do you do that in modern times when you can't do it on your own, right? So even things that we maintain, very important values that we maintain, need to be done in new ways. And Alan talks about medicine. As you know, I love it and very much take advantage of it. But ultimately, we're mortal. And so then the question, that goes back to the Garden of Eden story that you like, right? I do too. So what does that mean in terms of removing life support from people who are dying? When should you do it, and how should, and things that my grandparents never had to worry about, because when you were dying, period. Right? But now it's the old Kantian point. When can implies ought. When you cannot do something, then you never have to ask whether you should. You simply can't. But now that we can do all kinds of things, you do have to ask whether you should, because not everything that you can do, you should do. Right? You can smoke or abuse alcohol, but you should not. Now here's my Achilles heel. You can eat a half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week. And if you're doing it, it might as well be mint chocolate chip. Right? But you should not. I can tell you at 10 in the morning. I can't tell you that at 10 at night. Not so clear then, right? So the fact that you can do something doesn't mean that you should. And that's exactly the kinds of moral questions that you get in medical ethics these days, right? So, I mean, yes, enough is enough at some points. And you get that, I think, in the aspiration for holiness, but you get that also in the realization, in the wisdom part of our tradition. And by the way, part of the reason why our tradition is so wise is because the rabbis didn't do that for a living. The rabbis did all kinds of other things for a living, and so they knew. I'm talking about the classical rabbis. They knew the stresses of life, and they knew how to get joy out of life. And by the way, also happiness, right? And they knew how to get all of those things out of life in a life well lived in a concrete world. One last thing, and I'll stop, right? Just because I was much shorter than the other two presenters, I think I at least have the right to do this. I have a doctorate in philosophy. I love it. I also am a rabbi, and I love it. But there are two very different things in life, right? Philosophy is interested in definition analysis, all right? And that's really important for clear thinking, right? That's why I loved Dan's presentation yesterday, because he was really interested in trying to get clarity of what we mean by some of these terms, okay? But that's in some ways, that's the goal of philosophy, and I think it's a really important goal, clear thinking, right? Religion, the L-I-G in the word religion, comes from the Latin word, it means to connect, and that's the word where we get the word ligament, is connective tissue. Sometimes when a woman has had as many children as she wants, she has her tubes tied. That's called a tubal ligation. So religion is interested in our connections to each other, in families and communities, and to our connection to the environment and to God, right? Whereas, and those are really important. Connections are really important, but so is clear thinking, right? So I think both and. That's why I'm both a philosopher and a rabbi.
Thank you. So, Alan, you mentioned this a previous speaker, a previous scholar who wrote the pithy phrase "doing better, feeling worse,"
Yes.
and then you asked, in what ways can Judaism help address that larger question? And I wonder if we could flip that question. In what ways does Judaism contribute to that phenomenon of doing better and feeling worse? And I'm wondering in which ways you might think, how does Judaism contribute to the languishing that we heard about yesterday? And I'm wondering if you can give us a sort of a concise perspective, at
Sure.
least from a medical perspective.
Yeah, because look, the religious stuff I have to leave to the others. I can't, I don't know. But except that I'm a doctor and I take the Jewish religion seriously. And my point was just largely that religion can be used in a lot of different ways. That we might want to emphasize different parts of our tradition. Different parts are more helpful sometimes than others. Like an orchestra. Sometimes you want to bring out a different note, or like a good conductor will realize that at a certain point in the symphony, you got to bring out a slightly different voice. That's all. That was really my point. We need to be familiar with the whole tradition and understand that there are different parts to it. If I can give you one specific example, you take someone like, I think all the amazing innovations that Jewish doctors are responsible for, they're a great blessing for humankind, and we should only have more of them, truthfully. We may run up to intrinsic limits, but that's not for me to say. But then there's someone like Diane Meyer. Diane Meyer, I don't know if anyone knows Diane Meyer. But Diane Meyer, she's was at I think she's still on Mount Sinai. She's one of the founders of the whole field of palliative care. Now that's part of Judaism too. And she's Jewish, and she's so that deserves equally to be honored. That's all I'm saying. That's a very important part of the field as well, and something that that we as Jews should also treasure.
Thank you. And Shira, if I can just give you one more prompt here. When you were talking about Joseph Albo and his interpretation of Abraham's affect, if you will, post the Akedah, it made me think of Pninit's presentation on resilience and how, at least in the Israeli context, there has been a 2-year return to baseline, if you will. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily as humorous or as humorful as perhaps Abraham is purported to have been, according to Albo, but the baseline itself is not the same baseline as it was before the trauma has occurred, either before the Akedah or before October 7th. It's a new baseline. The people of Israel are different. Abraham himself is different because of that trauma, not despite it, but because of it. And I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit more with us about how you understand this transformative nature of resilience in the face of trauma and how that constitutes a kind of Jewish flourishing.
I'm certainly not a psychologist, but Tal Ben Shachar actually spoke a lot about post-traumatic growth, which I think an anti-fragility. He can speak about it much better than I could. I co-edited a book through the Sachs Herenstein Center, to which Chava contributed along with 45 other academics across disciplines about joy, inspired by the thought of Rabbi Sachs, but really in multiple disciplines. And Tal Ben Shachar wrote the foreword to that book. And we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress and how after October 7th or after tragedies or traumas, the lasting impact is what you were saying, kind of the baseline has moved far back and people have to try to, claw their way back to where they were before. And what his research shows, he writes a lot about the science of happiness. And what his research shows, where there's a lot of different dimensions of post-traumatic growth and anti-fragility, it's like building a muscle. And that sort of resilience enables one to come back, to that baseline from before the trauma, and even, surpass as a result of building up those sensibilities and emotions and psychological wherewithal.
And again, you lift up the notion of simcha instead of ashrei, or more than ashrei, as perhaps the ingredient that is particularly effective in this repair.
I mean, Rabbi Sachs talks about that really to distinguish the individual from the communal. And I think, as we've seen in the aftermath of October 7th or any 9/11, any sort of tragedies, the resilience of that, coming together, that unifying, especially a lot has been written about the divisiveness in Israel pre-October 7th, and then an instantaneous, coming together and, uniting, helping each other despite political or other differences. And I think, we saw the same thing, after 9/11. I think the communal, the social and moral responsibility Rabbi Sachs talks about in terms of the ethics of responsibility and, healing a fractured world, that very much contributes to the resilience that we see after large-scale traumas and large-scale catastrophes.
Jonathan, can I mention one other thing? I think it's important here to understand the way in which Judaism contributes to our flourishing in terms of the way it deals with our emotions. One of my brother and I moved to Los Angeles in 1971, and the first local rabbinical assembly meeting that we had, the speaker was a social worker who was a grief counselor, and she identified herself as Catholic. And she said, "You Jews do grieving much better than we Catholics do," right? Through the whole process of Shiva and all of that. On the other hand, when my daughter and son-in-law got married, my nephew, who was then a senior in high school, and who grew up in a not religious home, said he had never seen any unmitigated joy the way that he had seen at that wedding, right? So, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we have a very deep intellectual tradition, which I love. We have a very deep social action tradition, which I also love. I'm a past president of Jewish Family Service here. We do, as I put it, we do 60 different kinds of milut chasadim every single day. And I think that that's really important. But there's also the emotional piece of the Jewish tradition that I think leads to human flourishing, because it enables us to express both utter joy, unmitigated joy, as my nephew said, and also real sorrow, and everything in between.
And perhaps that emotion, emoting those feelings, expressing those feelings, acknowledging them instead of suppressing them, is part and parcel of what it means to be Jewishly alive. And that contributes to the catharsis and the healing processes that we get to experience. And Judaism has long been known to not exist in a vacuum. You can't be Jewish in a vacuum. You have to be a Jewish within a context, a community, etc., within a family.
If I could just add one other idea from Ecclesiastes, from Kohelet, in the 3rd chapter, it talks about the very famous, a time to weep and a time to dance. And that's, precisely what Ellie was saying. Rabbi Daron Perez, who lost a child, a son in battle on October 7th, and also married another one of his son who had been injured in the war, talked about holding those very, very polarizing emotions simultaneously. And I think, that kind of illustrates what Elliot was mentioning.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that kind of tension also existing in clinical moments, Alan, where you as a clinician, you're facing a patient who's asking, am I going to live? And the way to answer that, I can imagine, but I defer to those of you who actually work in clinics. I can imagine that one way to answer it is just as you always have, which is 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day at a time. No more, no faster and no slower than you ever have. That's how you live. How long, how many of those hours you might have, I have no clue. I will try to give you as many as you can, but will you live? You will live as you just have for the last 67 years.
Yeah, he wouldn't have bought that, isn't it? He wouldn't have bought that, isn't it? It's a good try, but he wouldn't have bought that one. People want to know. People want to know if they have a future or not. And then again, everyone has their own way of dealing with these impossible questions. I tend to try to be truthful, but also respond to what I think a person needs at the moment. That's what I think. You have to try to be there as a human being with the other person at that moment, and then you struggle with the questions as best you can.
And so, Alan, that communing is perhaps the community that both Elliot and Shira have been talking about. Is that you, as the healthcare provider within a clinical setting, you're providing that community sharing experience, and lifting up the both-andness within that tough and difficult and uncomfortable situation.
You try. Sure.
Lovely. So there's certainly time available for the community to raise questions. You can put it into the Q&A or into the chat. But I invite the panelists here, Alan, Elliot, and Shira, if you have questions or challenges to each other, if you'd like to raise them now.
Sure. Well, let's see if anyone. I could always ask a question, but let's see if someone. I've had my share of questions in this conference. So let's see if anyone else has any.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Well, Elliot, that gets back to the very first point that you raised about the people who are seeking conversion. Yeah. And you said that one of the repeated attractions that non-Jews find about Judaism is that Judaism welcomes questioning. Right. And one way to convert that sort of phrase is that Judaism embraces curiosity. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you and others could reflect a little bit more about to what degree does curiosity contribute to or even constitute a kind of flourishing?
Well, I had one of my graduate professors at Columbia in philosophy was Arthur Danto, and he said a philosopher is a 5-year-old child who never stopped asking why. That's who I am. Okay. I remember actually, we had to write a paper in 7th grade about something, and this was in public school, about, the Israelites or the Jews contribute to the world the notion that God is one. So I remember writing a paper, what difference does it make if God is one? Actually, variety is the spice of life. So why not? This is 7th grade me. And by the way, there's some good answers as to why God is one or God alone is a really important thing. But I mean, I think curiosity is really at the heart of philosophy, and I also think it's at the heart of Judaism. And I think it's a really precious part of it. And you need to understand that, I mean, that's not the way Judaism, sometimes the way that I put it is Judaism is an exoteric religion, not an esoteric religion, right? It's a religion that every Jew, it's the property of every Jew. Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha kihilat Yaakov, right? God commanded us the Torah. It is the inheritance of the entire community of Israel. And that's what then leads to the obligation to teach your children and to teach yourselves. And Judaism is a lifelong learning, right? And very different. My sophomore year of college, I had a Catholic roommate. This was 1962, before the Vatican abolished the index of books that Catholics were not allowed to read unless they got their priest's permission, right? And my roommate had found out that the Great Books course that we were all required to read our freshman year at college included some of the books on the index. And so I sat up with him one night to prepare him to confess to his priest that he had read these books without permission. And then when he came back, I said to him, Bob, how did it go? He said, well, I found out that at least in my tradition, forgiveness is easier to get than permission. But the point is that, and then certainly in many other traditions, the Mormons, for example, only the elite can know the secrets of the religion. Whereas for us, you teach it to your children, and Deuteronomy 29, once every 7 years, the Torah was to be read and explained to men, women, and children. right? So from the very beginning, this is a tradition that requires us to learn the tradition, to be curious about it, to ask questions. And I think it's a really, it's a precious part of what makes me a Jew.
I might have a question I could put to my two co-panelists.
Could I just
go ahead.
respond
Go
to that
ahead.
before you ask the question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Along that line of challenging and questioning and curiosity contributing to flourishing, I think one of the most impactful earliest essays that I've written, that I've read before my academic study, was an article called "Faith and Doubt" by Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who's the previous president of Yeshiva University, and some perceive kind of the ideal as having blind faith or simple faith or faith unmediated by any doubts. And what was so gratifying about that article for me as a very young student was not only giving permission to doubt, but showing how doubt or questioning or curiosity could really even enhance one's faith. And he divides up different types of faith: cognitive faith, affective faith, functional faith. And he talks about and uses a lot of different interesting sources. He shows how, as a result of doubt, one could strengthen one's faith because it leads you, it motivates you to explore and to be curious and to understand God's ways, God's world, et cetera, et cetera. And he writes, and this is very much consistent with the medieval, rational Jewish philosophical tradition. He says, doubts, according to this tradition, should not be brushed aside, but met head-on with the tools of metaphysical discourse. The prevalence of doubt does not invalidate the faith of those who do not experience, but our major concern must be those who are aware of and who will not ignore the confusing, questioning, and challenging world. And I think through exploration, through curiosity, one can achieve a stronger and a more enriched faith. And it's something that I think certainly contributes to human flourishing.
Could I pose a question to my two co-panelists or whoever else wants to comment on it? As I mentioned, as we all know, the cost of these pharmaceutical agents, the new drugs, is very, very steep. And I'm not sure where this is all going, but it just seems like it's likely to lead to some kind of problem, the cost of these new drugs. Where and how, I don't really know. But when the Affordable Care Act passed, and the way that President Obama tried to sell it, he said that the goal was to bend the cost curve. Bend the cost curve. That's what he was hoping to achieve with the Affordable Care Act. But it struck me at the time as an especially bloodless way to refer to extending more health care to citizens, that it was purely about cost. And it was coming from President Obama, who was a decent guy, a very caring guy. Just wondering if you guys have any thoughts about, something's gonna happen, just brute force because of all the money, but any thoughts about any other way to look at this, or to express concerns about how to organize our healthcare system outside the purely economic? That would be my question. And how does our religion create any possible framework that would be helpful in thinking about how to organize the way we provide medical care? Or maybe too big a question. But certainly providing healthcare to your population, that would be one aspect of flourishing. I would have to think that you don't want people, not getting care for the illnesses they have. That would not be a good society. But I don't know. I'll just throw that out there. Any ways that you might want to think about that or talk about it?
Well, it's chapter 12 of my book, Matters of Life and Death, A Jewish Approach to Modern Medical Ethics, in which I talk about a variety of different Jewish sources about the distribution of scarce resources. In previous eons, it was not so much healthcare, because until the 20th century, really, there wasn't a lot that doctors could do for you in a curative way. bloodletting, but that was, and then surgery, but that was about it. It wasn't until the early 20th century when you had sulfa drugs and then later antibiotics and then microsurgeries and all of that, right? But there was scarcity in the Jewish community in regard to poverty and also in terms of redeeming captives. And so you get a number of different sources in our tradition about how should we go about distributing scarce resources. I was on the ethics committee of Hillary Rodham Clinton's healthcare task force, may it rest in peace, in which we were trying to do the same sort of thing, namely, how do you distribute? To what extent is it part of protecting, providing for the general welfare, to take the preamble of the Constitution? To what extent does that now mean that we have to provide healthcare for people in ways that the government never did before, because people because medical resources were simply not available to extend people's lives very often. The psychological, social pieces of taking care of people were actually better, because when people were dying, they were dying at home, and their friends and family were there. I was actually on the first Jewish Hospice Commission. It was created by Rabbi Maurice Lamb, Norman Lamb's brother, in 1983, and then he left Los Angeles, and I became the second chair of the Jewish Hospice Commission. And I got a letter from Rabbi Emanuel Jakubowicz, who was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom at the time. How can you engage in hospice care? Doesn't that mean that you're giving up hope for healing? And I wrote back to him. I said, but Judaism certainly cannot be reasonably understood to require us to have unrealistic hope. And it was after that exchange that he allowed hospice care in Jewish hospitals in England. So I mean, part of it is end of life care. Part of it is throughout the life care. And again, on the one hand, we have all of these new drugs and all of these surgical procedures. On the other hand, some of them are not expensive at all, like antibiotics. Some of them are very expensive, like heart transplants and things like that. And one has to look at this from not just from a clinical perspective, but from a public health perspective. Namely, how much can the public pay for healthcare, and how should that be distributed? If you're looking for the most bang for the buck, as it were, right, then you would do a lot of primary care, primary health care. You would do a lot of prenatal health care and that kind of thing. You would not do the kinds of organ transplants that people might need. You might not do some of the surgeries that people might need, right? So it's not a slam dunk in any direction, but yes, providing.
What would be part of it? What is your view of flourishing?
That's right.
That would come out of it. Certainly great. Right. Some of you are old enough. I'm old enough to remember LBJ and the Great Society. Yeah. Great Society. It's a view of Medicare. Medicare itself comes out of LBJ's view of flourishing.
That's right. And Medicaid also. Yes.
Flourishing. They relate to that concept. But okay.
Yes, that's right. Now, the European countries have socialized medicine, which makes it more available, and for Canada too, makes medical care more available to more people. The downside of it is that whatever is in the general, what the society is giving now is not likely to change in the future, because that would mean more government investment in it. And it also means that the kind of medical innovations that are really true in our country don't happen very much in socialized medicine countries, right? Because there's no monetary incentive to do that. So I mean, if anything, there's a monetary disincentive, because that will mean that the government will have to pay more money for medical care. So there's no slam dunk way to do all of this. But yes, absolutely, Alan. Part of flourishing is that we're able to live in a healthy way. Yes.
And that gets back into what you were talking about, Elliot, about the incentive structure. Yeah. And so our culture, our secular culture, offers a particular model of incentivizing us to do X, Y, and Z, like research and development for new pharmaceuticals or surgical interventions. But Judaism offers a completely different incentive structure, if you will, about about how to pursue the good, whatever it might be. And one of the goods here is to be respectful of each other's time and attention. And I want to say thank you very much to Alan, to Shira, and to Elliot for your insights and your contributions to today's conversations and the conference overall. And I'd also like to say enough is enough. It's a great thing. And thank you so much for listening in. And Hava, I'm going to turn it back to you and to Joel for our final and concluding presentation.